everyone. When I began this project, I was interested in political violence and how it impacted our country's stability. But I had a hard time contextualizing this on a global scale until last December when there was a coup plot uncovered in Germany and a January 6th style insurrection in Brazil the next month. These events made me refocus my research on QAnon as a spreader of political violence outside of the United States and made me focus on Brazil and Germany in studying this phenomenon. Through my research, I found a rich history of conspiracy theories traveling across the Atlantic, meaning that QAnon is a modern example of an already occurring phenomenon, with social media being the diffuser rather than the sensational pamphlets of the 19th century. Firstly, what is QAnon? Many of you probably already have an idea of what it is, but through my research, I've come to the conclusion that QAnon is a collection of already existing conspiracies that are put into a right-wing political framework and that has spread due to the transatlantic exchange of ideas. There are various QAnon aggregate sites, also called Q archives, that have a collection of 4chan and 8kun posts that serve as a canon for this conspiracy. The posts are called Q drops among the community, and I use these sites to collect and analyze the original Q drops. When looking through the Q archives, I found references to various already existing conspiracies, such as the New World Order, in which the world is ruled by a pedophilic satanic cabal, and which has roots in the anti-Mason movement, as well as has anti-Semitic origins. The Kennedy assassination, false vaccine claims, Operation Mockingbird, in which CIA controls all of American media, and many more conspiracies were found as well. When looking at the wording of these posts, oftentimes they're written in encrypted style that invites readers to create their own interpretations. Here are the first and last Q drops, which gives a good visual of how these posts evolved and became more cryptic and subjective in nature. My thesis statement is that QAnon has spread outside the US through the historical process of the transatlantic exchange of ideas from which the conspiracy has adopted theories from. Conspiracies don't exist in a vacuum, but often take ideas from each other, and QAnon is a colorful example of different conspiracies interacting with each other. When looking at QAnon, we must understand the elements of conspiracy theories. While it's easy to write them off as pure nonsense, which, to be fair, most are, it is better to see them as a bizarre folklore to understand their appeal. James Deutsch and Levi Bachchanin wrote in Folklife magazine that folklore grows out of the hopes, fears, frustrations, and joys that a substantial number of the group's members share. The folklore provides comfort and stability as it helps build solidarity and cohesiveness among members of the group. This can be applied to conspiracy theories as well. The American historian Richard Hofstadter was the first to write about this perspective in the paranoid style of American politics. He described the anti-Mason Party as a powerful folk movement in the early 1800s that took up and extended the obsession with conspiracies. They came from the fears that the opportunities for common people would be closed off, and from northern anti-Jacksonian sentiment. The influence of the anti-Mason movement can still be felt today, with QAnon adopting the ideas such as the Illuminati and the New World Order. The next important understanding is the 5 myths of conspiracies. Jesse Walker theorized that conspiracy theories are defined by these myths to identify various enemies outside, within, above, and below, with a benevolent conspirator acting as a figure fighting for the people from behind the scenes. QAnon has elements of all 5, and this Ben Garrison cartoon shows Trump as the benevolent conspirator fighting an enemy from above, which in this case is the Democratic establishment. When looking at QAnon, it is a conspiracy theory that began online and used the internet to spread rapidly. When researching how online conspiracy theories spread versus the older conspiracies, I found three main ways of diffusion. First is the cycle of escalation on mainstream sites. Elise Tomer, a researcher of extremism, said that the social dynamics of platforms such as Facebook and Reddit create cycles of escalation in which the design of the platform encourages users to compete with each other to generate engagement, and the most engaging content is often the most extreme. Controversial content sells, and that has been a law in media throughout history. Then there is the second method of diffusion, in which after someone is exposed to QAnon on these mainstream platforms, they may look into alternative social media sites such as Truth Social. These sites act as an echo chamber, which creates a safe haven for QAnon believers and establishes further cohesion within the community, which can then further entrap people within the conspiracy. Lastly, meme culture is another method that QAnon has spread, using humor as a tool reflecting inner fears that support the conspiracy. Stephen Hessel, in the book Fear Itself, said that laughter and fear have both become inextricably linked in our modern and postmodern world to heavily defined and codified systems that frequently fail to notice the nebulous area between them. Both adhere to a complex matrix of aesthetic, narratological, moral, and iconographic images that dictate how we laugh and fear. Yet they tend to blur the conception of what we laugh at and what we fear. In such a situation, it becomes increasingly difficult to see the existence of a strong commonality. Fear and comedy are greatly overlapped, and the comedy can be used as a way to dilute the message and make it more appealing to a larger audience. Now we're going to look at the international spread of QAnon. This table here from Twitter shows that QAnon is a primarily English-speaking phenomenon in which Anglophone countries dominate with top 4 spots, with others kind of switching out on the 5th most active. This chart from Telegram shows a high number of German speakers, but researching the geographical spread is difficult. There's plenty of research on this, but it's often flawed. Looking at individual sites like these two sources are ends up showing the demographics of the site rather than where followers of QAnon are. I initially wanted to do my own research on this using Twitter, but unfortunately the terms of service changed in February, which prevented me from getting into the Twitter research API and forced me to be more dependent on others' research. I instead looked to learning the conspiracy traditions of Germany and Brazil and how QAnon adapted to the cultural and political context of both through journal articles and newspapers. All right. Germany's conspiracies come from a long history of anti-Semitism, with the most dangerous of all being the Judeo-Bolshevik myth. This came from the previous idea that Jews were spreaders of disease, which dated back to the Black Death. During the Russian Revolution, it was perceived that communism spread like a disease, leading to the conclusion that Jews then must in turn spread communism. This conspiracy was fundamental to the Nazi ideology and to the successive neo-Nazis. The Reichsbürgers were formed in the late 1980s out of the neo-Nazi movement. They believe that Germany is still under a legal Allied occupation and that the federal government is a corporation run by the Allies. They have been compared to sovereign citizens in the US, in which they have their own IDs, car plates, etc., under the German Empire, shown here. And the most interesting thing about them while researching them was that since 2017, they were very quick to adapt QAnon rhetoric, and they believe that Donald Trump will liberate Germany from Allied occupation. I believe they've done this because of the stricter laws on hate speech and suppression of extremist groups within Germany, which forced them to adopt Trump as a figurehead out of necessity, which wasn't the case for Brazil. Brazil has a long history of anti-communism from both within the upper class and as an export from the US. The former dictator Vargas used the Judeo-Bolshevik myth from Germany to justify purging political opposition in what is called the Cohen Plan, and then in 1964, there was a CIA-backed coup in which the US, in the midst of the Cold War, funded various anti-communist groups and supported the military in overthrowing the democratic government. This foreign intervention purposefully stoked paranoia within Brazil and created the myth that communism was inherently anti-Brazilian. Anti-communism held the defense of religion at the center of their rhetoric, and during the Cold War, it was conservative Catholicism that was at the base of this anti-communist rhetoric. But since the 90s, there's been a major shift in the religious demographics of Brazil, in which there's been a wave of Pentecostalism in Latin America coming out of the US. In Brazil, Pentecostals make up 30% of the population, and many subscribe to conspiratorial astrology, in which is the theology that focuses on the apocalypse and believes that we are currently living in the end times. Former President Jair Messias Bolsonaro has used anti-communist and evangelical rhetoric to create a base of support among the Pentecostal community in Brazil. He's often joked repeatedly that his destiny is in his middle name Messias, which is very similar to Messiah in Portuguese. He's using humor while also stroking apocalyptic fears from the Pentecostal community. QAnon in Brazil has put Bolsonaro as the benevolent conspirator fighting the deep state in the same way that they view Trump in America. Here's a funny headline about the Brazilian QAnon shaman being sued by the American QAnon shaman, showing just how similar these two movements are, except with different leading figures. And then this meme up here in the corner is making fun of the Bolsonarists after President Lula ordered for the arrest of the rioters in the Capitol, and the headline, and the headline of the two QAnon shamans highlights just the similarities between the conspiracies of North and South America. Ultimately, what are the consequences of QAnon? All three countries have attempted insurrections, and I looked at congressional testimony and reports to analyze the threat of QAnon. Brazil, Germany, and the US all had attempted insurrections. Germany was able to uncover the plot and arrest the organizer of the plot, a minor German aristocrat, Prince Heinrich, and 24 other conspirators. Brazil experienced an insurrection so similar to January 6th in the US that both had street vendors as it was occurring. However, in Brazil, it occurred when Congress was out of session. Lula was already officially the president, and Jair Bolsonaro was abroad in Florida at the time. The riots that occurred were out of desperation over Bolsonaro's loss and the fears from years of anti-communist fear-mongering about any center-left government from Brazil's higher classes and remnants of US propaganda. Lula's government was quick to react in arresting the perpetrators, and Congress was very quick to arrest them. All right. Congressional testimonies in the United States constantly warn of the erosion of trust within democratic institutions. This erosion has been perpetrated by far-right politicians such as Marjorie Taylor Greene in Georgia, and has helped to normalize conspiratorial far-right politics, which can then lead to increased right-wing violence and has a major destabilizing effect on the country. Can be seen in both Germany and Brazil as well. However, both of those governments have been quicker to react and attempt to prevent this. In conclusion, QAnon is just a bundle of existing conspiracy theories within a political framework, which allowed it to be flexible in different cultural and political circumstances. This phenomenon is not new and has been happening for many years. The new main driver is the internet. Due to globalization of communication, QAnon's flexibility has allowed it to spread outside of the US and disrupt the stability of other countries, such as Germany and Brazil. This phenomenon can continue to be studied, and there may be more dire consequences of this conspiracy in the future. This is still a very much developing story and concept. If someone has a deeper knowledge of R and Python codes, then they make a web scraper to go into more depth and getting raw data, which I was unfortunately unable to do. I'd like to thank my professors, Jeff Keith and David Abernathy, for their guidance, especially David Abernathy working with trying to figure out that Twitter API. That was really, really hard. And then I'd like to thank my fellow Global Studies seniors for the solidarity of getting through this project. Thank you.